Let's start with something which is kind of important for me, because when I got this invitation, and I'm really very honored to be here, there were three important things that motivated me very much to come. One, of course, is that I always like Poland, and I do believe many Bulgarians do. But the second is that I always like conferences which are taking place on the eve of the elections. Because normally people these days said that election does not matter so much, but the truth is that it's not the case. Anytime when you have conferences on the eve of the elections, people are sensitive in a different way, they're much more emotional. So when you have all these politics-centered conferences, the conversation is different. In my view, it's much more serious, it's much more interesting. Because when we talk about democracy, and I'm going to try to say something about this, there is two important things about elections and democracy which normally we're not thinking much about. Already Tocqueville in the 19th century noticed the following fact. Democracy regulates the social life by a strange combination of dramatizing everything and trivializing everything. And from this point of view, the elections are playing a very important role. On the eve of the elections, you always have the feeling that the world is going to end just tomorrow. Politicians saying how bad the things are or how much the things should change, and you have really the feeling that something dramatic and catastrophic is going to change. And then on the day after the elections, you have this trivialization of the same problems that have been discussed before. And I do believe that this kind of a very strange dynamic between dramatization and trivialization is one of the explanations how elections in a certain way are creating a cycle, allowing us to talk about change and at the same time continuation. But the second is, the elections is the time when societies are forced to talk about the future. They can talk about the future in a stupid way. You can have politicians that can promise things that are totally unrealistic. But anyway, these are the way to push you to see, and if you're going to be an ordinary citizen, to see beyond today, to try to imagine how your society is going to look in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. So from this point of view, this type of election, all these conferences around elections, in my view, always has a different dynamics. The second reason was this name of the conference. Freedom Games, I found it, I don't know who came with the name, but I found it quite interesting because, for two reasons. One is that this time, and this was very much true in foreign policy as domestic politics, many people are asking themselves, what is the game? You can see it very much in the foreign policy. What is the game that politicians are playing? Obviously, it's not chess. It's not this type of kind, rationally and very strategic moves. But is it a poker where everybody is just gambling and trying to take risks in order to achieve this and that and bluffing? Or even if this is this famous kids game of scissors, stone and paper, where basically, depending on what kind of choice you believe the other is going to do, you're coming with your response and your chances to win. Because the problem with the freedom games is that I do believe it's changing also the way we're talking about democracy. What I didn't like about the invitation was the title of my talk. Because saving democracy, I always first find it very pathetic. Secondly, I do believe that democracy was to save us, not us to save democracy. But thirdly, which is much more important, it assumes that even if we talk about the crisis of democracy, this is one and the same crisis everywhere. But is this true? For example, in Europe, 4 or 5 years ago, you're going to listen to a lot of people who said the problem with the democracy on the European level is that it's too consensual, that there is no radical alternatives, that there is not enough polarization, that all politicians are saying the same things and doing the same things. Now, in many places, people said, and they said, what we need is much more politicization. We need a much more clear alternative. We want a much more hard left and much more hard life in order to have a real choice. You go to the United States, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, and basically they're telling you the biggest problem with democracy is total polarization. You have the feeling that, for example, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they're not living in the same country. That basically the government is becoming dysfunctional as the result of this polarization. Can we come with the same solution to these different problems? Is the problems which democracy is facing in places like Bulgaria and Poland the same like in places like Spain or Greece? So from this point, I'm not going to talk about saving. And by the way, also, the verb saving has much more meanings. You can save democracy in the way you're saving money, simply not spending it today. But I'll try to do something slightly different. I'll try to talk how we can reflect and discuss on the perceived crisis of democracy in the way that is not apocalyptic and that is trying us to improve it. And the first question that I want to ask is, was any time democracy not in crisis? If you start reading about democracy, especially if you're starting to reading the newspapers from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in Western Europe, you're going to see the discourse of democracy is always discourse of crisis. In 1970s, when after the 1968, and of course there was the war of Vietnam, there was the terrorist wave in places like Germany and West Germany and Italy, Willy Brandt, then being the Chancellor of Germany, said, I'm not giving democracy more than 20 or 30 years. He said, in 20 or 30 years, the world is going to be totally dominated by dictators. These dictators could be the communist type, or they can be a kind of a military type, but democracy cannot survive. When you go and you can see that this type of criticism of democracy was coming both from the left and right. And now when we're talking how democracy was very well functioning, for example, in 70s and 80s, and this is especially true for East Europeans, that this is how we see how the Cold War democracies have been functioning. One of the reasons we were so sure that democracy was functioning very well was that we were not there. But if you're going to see that people living there, how they have been reflecting on what there was happening, it was very much a very strong feeling that democracy is not doing what it's achieved to do, that democracy is not in the way it should be, and there was all this permanent fear that democracies are performing much worse than the authoritarian alternatives. For example, it was 1982, 7 years before the communism collapse, when Revel, one of the leading French political scientists, came with a book which was called Why Democracies Will Perish. And he was basically trying to show that the West's reaction to the solidarity in Poland shows how weak democracies are, that because of what we're seeing, democratic system cannot survive, because democracies first are undecisive, they're very difficult at taking decisions, they're not ready to take risks, it's a too complex system, it's too self-critical, while the dictatorships are much better organized, much easier to take risks. And this was repeated and repeated, and only when time has passed, we have the feeling that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the situation had been good and then democracy was flourishing, but now we have a major crisis. By the way, even in Eastern Europe, I decided just to go back to some of the things being written about Poland by Poles about 1993, 1994, 1995, and people are going to say democracy does not work, it's total fragmentation, political parties are so bad, there was all this war on the top. I'm saying this because the first thing that I'm going to argue is that the only way democracy can talk about itself is as a crisis. For a while, it was changed, and I'm going to put it when it started talking about itself after the end of the Cold War in a global terms. And part of the problem which we're facing now is very much related to the way that democracy started to talk about itself as a kind of a permanent success and solutions to all problems. But otherwise, talking about the crisis of democracy is the way democracies talk about themselves, because the major advantage of the democratic regime is their capacity for self-correction. Among the people who came with the most strong criticism of democracy, one of them, of course, was Winston Churchill, who said that there is no stronger argument against democracy than a 10-minute talk with an ordinary voter. This type of a fear that when people are going to have power, they're going to make some stupid things was always present. And even today, when we're trying to talk about democracy, authoritarianism, and others, we should remember that Aristotle, when he was making his basically description of difficult regimes, he was always describing the regimes as a couples. For example, as you know, his major distinction was societies and basically regime where the one is ruling, where the few are ruling, and where the many are ruling. And his major story was there is a cases in which one can rule, and this is a kind of a good monarchy, and there is a cases in which it can easily degenerate into a tyranny. You can have an aristocratic rule of few, and this few could be quite competent, and they can be quite public-minded, and then the regime functions, but then you can have oligarchical regime where basically these few are simply exploiting the many. And also you can have when the people are running, when the many are running, but then he said there are two regimes again. You had democracy, very much perceived as the wise rule of the many, but also you have the rule of the mob, where the fact that many are ruling are not making the regimes better. I'm saying this because one important thing happened after 1989. And I'm very much blaming political scientists, being one of them, for some of the problems that we are facing now, because after 1989, and especially in the 1990s, we started to make a total generalization about democracy and what kind of things democracy can produce. For example, in political science, we have something which is called democratic peace theory, which is based on a very clear empirical fact. And the empirical fact is that, as a rule, democracy do not fight each other. Out of this, we say, if all the countries in the world are going to be democracies, they're not going to be wars. The problem with this statement is a very simple one. We had a very few democracies on the basis of which we can make this type of conclusion. And also the same political scientist shows that countries which are in a transition to democracies are much more ready to start a war than either democracies or classical authoritarian regimes. But we started to talk about democracy as the solution of every problem that comes. For example, when you show that there is a positive correlations between democracy and lower level of corruption, this is one thing, but to say that it's enough to have free elections in order to basically cure a country from corruption, this is not true. This is simply not true. There are empirical data that democracies are doing better in economic terms than non-democratic regime, which does not mean that non-democratic regime cannot deliver economic growth, and of course China is a very great example of this. So what happened to democracy was a classical case of overselling. We created a totally false expectations of what democracy can do and what cannot do. And as a result of it, I do believe to a great extent, we prepared some of the crises because to any problem that people are facing, we always had one and the same answer: democracy. How we're going to save, for example, the problem with the global warming? Let's have it more participation in democracy. How we're going to save the problem of war and peace? Let's have more participation in democracy. Anytime when you have one answer to all questions, either there is something wrong with your questions or there is something wrong with the answer. And I'm saying this because in a certain way, as a result of it, I do believe we kind of missed one of the major reasons why we saw the spread of democracy for all these years, and why democracy, better than any type of a regime, fits to some of the problem of the modern world. I was reading recently Jonathan Sachs, a famous religious thinker, who basically said the following. He said, we are living in a world where we have more choice than ever before, but we have maximum choice and minimum meanings, because most of the institutions are maximizing our choice, but they're not telling how to choose, what to choose. For example, the market is allowing you to choose anything you want, but it is not instructing us what is the choice, the good choice for us. Democracy is allowing us to make very different choices, but the democratic institution itself is not telling you how to choose and what to choose. We started to live also in the world without why. We stopped asking questions why we're doing this or not doing this. The idea was always how. The major problems that we're trying to solve was always coming as a technological problem, technological solutions. And this, as I told you, managed to hide, in my view, the major advantage why democracies are spreading and why people in the different parts of the world, even the authoritarian governments, are not trying to sell their model as the one that works. Because neither the Chinese nor Mr. Putin are going to come and say authoritarianism is better than democracy. Russia insists that they're democracy, and by the way, China insists that they're democratizing, but they're democratizing in their own way. Why they don't basically claim that they have a regime which is better? Why China, which has been economically growing for the last 40 years, it was quite impressive growth, why they're not trying really to export the whole of their model, but of course they have been interesting to export here and there some of their repressive tactics, which is totally different. And in my view, the story is the following. The modern society and the consumption society in general, all this idea of choice that we have and on which the global economy is based, strangely enough produce dissatisfied people. The more we are choosing, the more dissatisfied we are. And by the way, this is how the market functions. The first moment when you are buying something, you're already dissatisfied with what you have bought, and basically the market hopes that you're going to buy the next one, to the extent that many kind of stores are allowing you in a week to return what you have bought in order to buy something else. Dissatisfaction is what is driven society. But democracy is the only one that can deal with dissatisfaction. In the authoritarian regimes, you should provide satisfaction because you are not providing the instrument to people to react when they're dissatisfied. For example, how China is going to function if you can imagine that economic growth is not going to be there anymore. We know that legitimacy is very much coming from the fact that Chinese economy is delivering. Of course, unevenly, more to one than others, but you have the idea of economic growth. How this is going to function if this is not there. In the case of Russia, it was very clearly, because to be honest, I do believe that the major reason Mr. Putin decided to go to Crimea was that Crimea for him was the way to decouple his popular support from the economic performance of the government. After Crimea, in a certain way, the personal support for President Putin is not anymore related to how the economy functions, which was not the case before, because the very legitimacy of the regime was very much based on the fact that it was the regime which was increasing, as Slavoj Inozemtsev was saying, very much the economic well-being of the people. So in a moment in which you never can be sure how strong your economic performance could be, the biggest question is how you're doing with dissatisfaction. How do you doing with people who are unhappy, by the way, even when they have more goods and more choices, and the more choices they have, the higher is the chance that they're going to be dissatisfied. And here democracy provides a mechanism. Because democracy provides you the idea that you can vote and change this government, and the change of the government is going to produce a meaning, it is going to be very different. None of the other regimes can do this. And this is why, for a kind of a modern society, authoritarian regimes, even when they're very smart, when they're technologically well developed, when they're not repressive in a traditional sense, basically going with the physical violence after people, they feel insecure exactly because in the time of crisis, they don't have this mechanism of dealing with dissatisfaction. At the same time, if this is true, I do believe we are facing question, and this is the second part of my talk, which is putting democracy in a slightly more uncertain and in a certain way risky land than before. And the story that if this is true, the classical opposition between democracy and authoritarianism is not going to help us to understand how our societies are going to function. Because we are easily calling any type of political regime that we don't like authoritarian, but most of these regimes are much more democratic majoritarianism than a classical authoritarianism. Is Erdogan's Turkey authoritarian regime? Is it not true that he is winning free and fair elections and the majority of people are supporting him? And is it also not true that this majority of people are trying to enforce their views and norms on the minority of the people? And basically, you don't want to be journalist in Putin's Russia, but you also don't want to be journalist in Erdogan's Turkey, because the number of the arrested journalists in Turkey is higher than in Russia. So I'm saying this because in a certain way, the classical question before, how you're coming to power, are you elected or not elected? Because one of the famous definitions of democracy is that democracy is a regime in which you have elections with unexpected outcome. This is not enough anymore to understand the nature of the political regimes that we are facing. In July 2014, Hungarian President Viktor Orban gave a very famous speech about the rise of illiberal democracies. And then he said the following. He said, listen, the West is in decline. There is a decadent culture. what we are seeing for the last 15, 20 years is not going to function anymore. We should look around. We should look to what happened on the East. And we should be very much trying to follow the successful models of countries like Turkey, Singapore, Russia, China. The most strange about this speech is that there is no any political scientist who is going to put these four countries in the same group. Singapore being a very classical but meritocratic authoritarian regime, China being what it is, Russia being what it is, Turkey being a competitive democratic system but very much with repressing some of the rights of the minorities. So why he put them together? And here is the story which I'll try to offer you. Some years ago, a famous Harvard economist, Danny Roderick, basically came with something which he called the paradox of globalization. He said, in our global world, most of the governments are trying to maximize three things. They try to be democratic, they try very much to be integrated as much as possible in the global economy, and they try to have self-government, basically sovereignty, independence. The problem of globalization, he said, is that you always can have two of these three, but you never can have these three together. You can have a regime which is democratic and sovereign. And by the way, the United States is very much going with this model, because if you're going to see, at the moment when the crisis of globalization started, many of the United States said, one of the things that you can do is not so much to rely on your interdependence, but your independence. The shale oil became as important in a way as anything else, because it's going to allow a big country as the United States to try to remain democratic and sovereign at the same state. You can be also authoritarian and very much integrated in the global economy, like in the case of China, and this allows you to have a very good economic results because the rights of the workers are totally unrespected, and because if Marx was going to be alive, he's going to say that the exploitation in places like China is much higher than anything that you can see in the West. Or you can try to be democratic and highly integrated like in the European Union, but then this is at the cost of sovereignty. And I do believe that many countries saw it very clearly when it comes to the economic crisis and when it comes to other policies. The basic problem is that nevertheless that these three does not go together, as Danny Roderick is saying. All the politicians at least try to create the illusions that you can have the answer to how these three can go together. And this is what I do believe Mr. Orban was trying to suggest. What he was saying is, listen, you can be integrated in the global economy, being a small place like Hungary, with a very open economy. 60% of the exports of Hungary are coming from the 4 German companies. So to imagine that Hungary can close itself in the way China or the United States can do it is simply unpractical. But then you should try to have a very strange type of a democratic system. You should have an overwhelming majority. You're going to have a political majority which is going to be totally identified with the state. You should have an opposition which is going to be perceived as totally illegitimate. So you're going to have democracy without pluralism, and this is the only way for your state to be competitive. And on the other side, you have the authoritarian regimes, and as I said, some of them being much more sophisticated than we're ready to recognize, saying, listen, it's not about simple repression. This is getting as much true information as possible from the public, but not allowing the people to mobilize for any type of a collective action. In China today, there is no problem if in the social networks, internet and others, you decided to criticize policies or even concrete persons in the Chinese leadership. Even more, the Chinese government has thousands of people who are working on this information, and on the basis of this type of signals, they're trying to do certain changes. You don't need police informers anymore in the age of Facebook because people are informing on themselves on a daily basis. The basic problem is that at the moment when you're complaining about certain injustice, the government is taking it and trying to react. But if you're going to ask 2 other people to join you to protest, then you have a problem. Your blog is going to be banned. You can be arrested. Then you are in a conflict. because the new technologies are allowing the authoritarian regimes to do something that the communist regimes didn't have before, to get the real information coming from the real action of the people and not the information coming basically very distorted from the police. But on the other side, they're not going to allow people to organize. So what you're doing in a situation in which it's not simply that authoritarianism are going to replace democracy when democracy is in crisis, but the biggest problem is what is going to be the balance between freedom and control in a democratic regimes itself. So here basically I'm going to go to the last point of my presentation. And my story is that in order to answer this question, there is one thing that we should not do, and this is trying to give a global answer. And secondly, to believe that this answer could be totally kind of ideological in its nature. Democracy is a regime which is very much based on the equality of the experiences of people. It's not that we're equally smart or that we're equally rich or even that we're equally good. But the problem of the democratic regimes is that we have an experience which is very unique, and I know better what is good for myself than anybody else. As a result of it, this experience is extremely important, and this experience is what basically is trying to educate me and to allow the regimes to improve. Many people, and I'm one, who believe that Poland is one of the most amazing stories in political and economic terms in the last 25 years. But unlike many others, I do believe that the period of the peace government also contributed to this, for the special reasons that many people understood what they don't like about it. And as a result of it, you have a social learning. How a different government after this one is going to look, I don't know. But I do believe that if you're going not to allow people to make wrong political choices, if everybody starts to fear that people are going to do something wrong, and people are doing wrong things all the time, and we're going to prevent this, this is creating not a smaller problem for democracy than basically some of the choices which people are going to do. So as a result of it, how to save democracy? I do believe that anybody who comes as a savior of democracy is going to be probably the one that is going to hurt it much, because he believes that he knows better than anybody else what should be done. I do believe that we should allow the societies to make mistakes and to learn from these mistakes. Some of these mistakes could be painful. Some of these mistakes basically are going to create type of realities that probably we don't like. But this is how democracy has been working for all these years. And from time to time, when we basically say that something is a mistake, we should be sure that probably it's mistakes from our point of view and not from the point of view of anyone else. I'm going to finish with a story of a film, trying to basically argue that nevertheless that there are many people today who are very critical about democracy, very critical about authoritarianism, about liberalism. None of them really is going to come with an alternative. And the reason they're not going to come with the alternative is the following. There was this famous film which the famous Russian movie director and very close friend to the Russian president, Nikita Mikhalkov, did, and the film was called 12. This is one, by the way, of the most ideological products of the Putin year. And the film is very important because it's a total remake by one of the most famous American films from the 1950s. It is called 12 Angry Men. And this is a kind of a total praise and story of the liberalism. 12 Angry Men is a story of a jury of 12 persons who should take a decision about the guilt of a Puerto Rican boy who was accused of killing somebody. The story looks very clear. Everybody was sure that in 15 minutes it's going to end. 11 of the members of the jury are ready to vote after hearing the first witnesses, but there is one person who is not convinced. And this one person starts asking questions. And during the whole movie, basically you can see day by day, hour by hour, how on the basis of these rational arguments, the another 11 persons changed their view and came to the conclusion that this person is innocent. So this was the story of liberalism as a story in which reasonable doubt, the fact that we can disagree, is going to help us to go to truth. Mr. Mikhalkov is doing this film which is basically telling the story of the 11 juries which are trying to see the guilt of a Chechen boy who was accused of killing somebody. And this is exactly the same story. 11 persons are sure that he is guilty. They're ready to vote immediately for sending him to jail. But there is one person, former KGB officer, who starts asking questions. And hour by hour, it ended up that, of course, the boy was not killed anybody, but there are people who try to take control of the building. They want to do some construction works there. And because this boy and his father was not agreeing to give it, they created this case in order to have the possibility to have their business. So now everybody was ready, like in the American film, to vote the boy free. But here the ex-KGB officer said, no, I'm not going to vote him free. Because if I'm going to vote him free, people who set him up, they're going to kill him. So there are two options, he said. Either we should take care of him, or we should send him to prison, because this is the only way for him to be alive. I'm saying this because the basic problem with democracy is that we have all this criticism about democracy, about liberalism, but the major argument of the people who are against are saying, listen, we know that probably liberalism is bad, is good, but we're going to put you in prison because this is the only way to survive. And I don't believe it's a very strong argument. Thank you very much.